So when you look going forward, there's no certainty on where resource prices are going to go, and we don't have the crystal ball on that. But when we look at the amount of investment that is going to be needed in oil and gas and mining, under any different scenario, so even if we try to hit a 2-degree climate pathway, or even if we continue as kind of business as usual, there's going to be a huge amount of new investment needed, both to meet incremental demand, but to replace supply that's coming to the end of its natural life. Peter Voser, the CEO of Shell, put it best when he said that just to keep oil supply constant, we have to find the equivalent of 4 Saudi Arabias or 10 North Seas over the next 10 years. Now, this actually represents a huge opportunity for low-income countries. 90% of historical resource investment has been in upper middle income or high income countries. Going forward, we think the share of going to low income countries could potentially double. So a higher share of a much larger share of total investment. And to put this in sort of order of magnitudes, the amount of investment we're talking about could be as much as 5 times the levels of ODA, overseas development assistance, going into these countries. And when you look at that of how it could translate into poverty impact, we see the potential, if these countries get it right, to take more than 540 million people out of poverty over the next 20 years. And to put that in context, that is greater than the amount that China managed to pull out of poverty over the last 2 decades. So this could be a fundamental transformational story in the world's fight against poverty. So I think there it's around how do they most effectively partner with the private sector to really get the speed of change that we all want. And one of the interesting issues of the link to the private sector is that they're undergoing at the moment a fundamental transformation themselves. And there really is a shift that's ongoing from a extractive mindset to a more development mindset in these companies. And the reason really is threefold. First of all, a large share of where they're producing is shifting to low-income countries. And so they need to change their mindsets to adopt to these local contexts. The second is that the resource prices have become more volatile than they ever have in history. And when resource prices are volatile, it makes it a lot harder to maintain the social contract, because there's always a risk of one party feeling like they're missing out. And then finally, a lot of these projects are a much larger share of the economies in which they operate. And so they're really high on the radar of the public, and hence the expectations of what they're going to deliver are a lot higher as a result. So to deal with this changing resource landscape, we really think there needs to be a reorientation of their approach of extractive companies and really become a lot more sophisticated and scientific about how they meet the expectations of local stakeholders, and do that in a way which is compatible with shareholder value. There's lots of interesting examples we find of extractive companies that have really played a meaningful role in the economic development of these different countries. And just to highlight a few, when we think about local content, a lot of the really big transformations happen from companies such as OCP in Morocco that did a quite significant step change in the local procurement which they had in their operations. Anglo American has been quite successful in their Anglo-Zamili program, which has tried to kickstart local entrepreneurship around local mining activity, a lot of them supplying the mines in which they're surrounding. So there's a number of really interesting examples across different extractive companies that we can allude to. But I think the real challenge is how do these extractive companies take the next step and really integrate them into a full package of support, working with both donor agencies and multilaterals, as well as the host governments, to really crack the economic development challenge in these countries. The green economy topic is something that McKinsey's looked at in previous research, and we published a report in 2011 which we called the Resource Revolution, which looked at how can the world meet its food, its energy, its material and water needs over the next 20 years, and also how do we think about reaching our climate goals, and particularly this 450 ppm 2-degree climate pathway. And what was really interesting from that research is that we found that there was opportunities to improve resource productivity that would reduce the need for resources by up to 30%. And that we had a clear path to achieve a 2-degree climate pathway through a combination of resource productivity and shifts in the energy mix. But what's interesting, and this is where this report sort of picks up, is that even in any different scenario that we can imagine, even a climate change scenario, we're still going to need a huge amount of new resources, particularly to satisfy the demand of the consuming class in emerging markets. but also to replace those existing sources of supply that are coming to the end of their natural life. And often in resources, that there've been the resource curse, that actually rather than being a tailwind for economic development, it's actually been a headwind. And even countries that have been able to grow their economies often have not done that in an inclusive way. And in fact, many resource-driven countries have seen poverty levels increase at the same time with quite strong economic growth. So the key challenge of how do we make it inclusive is actually a broader challenge, and we think it requires a different economic model. There's a lot of focus at the moment of saying, well, can resource-driven countries adopt the Asia Tiger growth model that transform the economies of Korea, Singapore, and more recently China? But we don't think that model is fit for purpose for these kind of economies. We think they need a new kind of model to ensure that we have inclusive, sustainable growth. We think this model has basically 6 key components. The first component is, how do these countries think about their role of the state in the resources sector? And here it needs to go beyond thinking of just, do we have a national champion or do we have just a private sector-led model, but actually understanding which of these models works best under what context. The second issue is really around how do we think about infrastructure, and particularly shared infrastructure that gets used between other industries, but also with other users. And this could be road, railways, ports, and energy. The third issue is around fiscal policy and competitiveness. And here we need to go beyond just thinking about government take, but thinking more broadly about how government and the private sector work together to really boost competitiveness. And then there's issues around local content. So how do we get more of the demand for goods and services and people that are sourced locally rather than overseas? And then finally, the last 2 issues around how do we actually transform that value into long-term development? So how do we think about spending the windfall effectively? And then finally, how do we think about economic diversification? And in each of these areas, we spent quite a lot of time looking at which countries have achieved success. And often we find the lessons come from very surprising places.